All right, welcome to the next video in this series on using Java and AWS Serverless to build a REST API that manages data in a package data store that is AWS S3. In this video, I'm going to show how to fetch an individual quote by ID. So thus far, we've seen how to construct a create REST endpoint that accepts a post request to save quotes to an S3 data store. And then in the next video, we saw how to list our quotes that are saved in S3, and we're seeing the results of that in front of us here. So now we're going to see how to make a GET request to get a individual quote by the ID, which is also the key, the S3 object key. All right, so I like to start this type of endeavor in making my first updates in my AWS SAM CloudFormation template. So again, I will take my list REST or list Lambda resource, and I'll make a copy of that and paste it below. And so this is going to be a get quote function. And the Java class that I'm going to create for this is going to be named get quote. And then of course it'll map to just a Lambda request handler because I'm going to implement the request handler interface from the AWS Java SDK. And of course my code is still going to live in this quotes API directory. And we're still working with Java, and it of course needs access to the S3 bucket. So we'll continue to inject the quotes S3 bucket name as an environment variable, and specify it needs the IAM policy for create, read, update, delete, even though we're only going to use the read functionality. I think it's fine just to keep the same policy. It makes it simpler. And then now, so thus far we've just used API URIs of quotes, but I'm going to introduce a new functionality, which is path parameters. So a lot of the times in just like a standard REST API, you'll have detail endpoints, which might have a path parameter of like say ID, or maybe like slug, something of that nature. Which in an AWS SAM template, you can specify that using the very familiar syntax that I'm showing here, where you put curly brackets inside your path definition, and then the name of some variable. So ID or author maybe. However, if we look down here at how our ID is constructed, well, since S3 paths or keys are technically valid HTTP URL URIs, and I have a delimiter in there, I can't just add ID like this, because it's going to find this / delimiter, and it's going to think that it's got two parts to it. So what I'll do instead is I'm going to say author, and then I'll add another path parameter, and this is going to be file name, right? And that sort of matches what our ID anatomy looks like. So we have the name of the author that created the quote, and then a file name, so to say, if there were such a thing in S3, equal to the hash code of that quote, object contents, and then I threw a .json file extension on there. So that will basically decompose that into the author portion and then the file name portion. And we are going to work with a GET request. So everything else can remain the same, and I will make my GET quote Java class. So I got a new class to be created inside of the coding interface quotes package, and I'll paste in the get quote name there that I copied from the handler, and let me push enter. And then I'm gonna pop open my list quote here so I can use that as a cheat sheet for creating this guy. So let me do implements request handler. Implements request handler. And like that. And so the parameters to my generic there are, again, API gateway proxy request event and API gateway proxy request response event. Let me copy those, we'll paste them over here. And then I'll come over here and I will tell it to implement my request handler method. Right on. All right. So first things first, I'll make the base response object. So response equal to new API gateway response event with headers. And I'll go ahead and just steal my headers from over here. And just like that. All right, and I shouldn't need that open anymore, so I can close this. All right, so we're going to use our repository class once again to interact with the backend data store. So let's create a new instance of that. So quotes repo equals new quotes S3 repository, and that takes two parameters, right? So the name of our bucket, which is an environment variable. So let me say get env quotes bucket, which again comes from this environment variable being injected and the template. And then the second parameter that it expects for this constructor is a logger, which I can get from the context parameter in my request handler. So context get logger. All right, so after that, I need to interrogate or query those path parameter values back out that I defined right here, which of course are going to be author and then file name. So back over in my get quote class, I will pull that out. So var author equals the, that's a long name. Let's call this the request. Request get path parameters, which is just a dictionary, and I can call get and then, or not dictionary, hash map, sorry, a hash map, and I can say give me the author path parameter, and then we'll get the file name. So file name equal to request get path parameters, and then we'll get file name. All right, so we can say var ID equals then string format %s followed by /%s, and that is of course the author and then file name. Very cool. So then we can use the get function on our get method on the quotes repo. So quotes repo get, pass it the ID. Of course, we can see that responds with an optional of quote. So optional result quote. And we'll need to import that. And then so I should check, so I should see if result is empty. Well, that means we didn't find it. So let's respond with a proper response code. So let's return response with a status code HTTP connection of HTTP not found. So 404. Otherwise, we'll serialize that down into JSON and respond with the quote that we did find. So of course we'll need a JSON class instance, so new JSON, because that's what we're using to work our serialization magic between the strings that represent JSON and our quotes object. So let's return response with status code HTTP URL connection HTTP OK, so a 200, and then the body is going to be JSON, so to JSON. And then we got result, and we just get the quote back out of that optional. That should do it for the handler, which is very synonymous with like a controller, right? And maybe like Spring Framework or something like that. So let's put together the implementation of our repository so that when we call get, we actually stand a fighting chance to get an instance of a quote back out. Well, earlier we implemented this download from key helper class or helper method. We can use that in this case because it basically gives us the stock functionality that we're interested in. So let's say return optional of and download from key, and our ID is the same thing as the key at the moment. And this stands the chance of throwing an exception because we're making a networked request. So let's throw a try catch in there. Make sure we handle that. So logger log failed to fetch quote for ID, and then let's say logger log e, and we'll get the message of the exception, and we'll return optional empty. Put this in the body of the try catch, something like that. Okay, so let's retrace our steps here. We added a new resource in our CM CloudFormation template of a get quote serverless Lambda function, and we mapped that to a get quote Java class, which we have here. The path are quotes, and we have two path parameters or path variables, one of author, one of file name. Expects a get request. Here is our request handler Java class get quote. We create a response object, a base response implementation with headers. We construct our quotes S3 repository, call our parse out the author and file name path parameters, construct an ID, aka S3 key, and then we call get on our quotes repo to get a quote back out. If none was returned, then that means we'd return a 404 not found. Otherwise, we serialize that down to JSON in our response body with the 200. So, easy peasy, right? Let's build, deploy, and verify that this works. So let's do a SAM build. And a SAM deploy. All right, so we can see that we're adding a few new resources, our quotes function, a role for that function, Lambda permission to be added to that role. So that's basically an IAM policy. And then we're updating our API gateway because we have a new path and method pair. Things are getting created and updated. Looks like everything's working so far. All right, home stretch. Awesome. So let me get an ID of an existing quote. So we'll just call our existing listing endpoint, so quotes, and that will give me our quotes back again. I can grab one of those IDs and we can fetch an individual quote. All right, so those are our two quotes that have been saved there thus far. Let me grab this guy and just up arrow, and I'll paste that on there in the end. So again, this is our author, that's our file name, make a GET request. And there's our quote by Donald Guth. Awesome. All right, so that's how we can implement a simple, GET request for an individual quote, and means we only have one more piece of functionality to show, and that's the delete. So please join me in the next and final video where we see how we can make a delete REST API endpoint, which handles, will implement our Java-based logic to delete a quote, aka an S3 object, from our S3 back to Datastore. So I hope you found that interesting, and if you have the time, please join me in the next video.